The year was 1972, the same year that Bobby Fischer won the world championship in his match against Boris Spassky. At the same time, there was a very young, very talented Soviet player by the name of Anatoly Karpov, who would have been about 21 years of age. And we're going to look at a game of his at that exact same time. As you know, of course, after Fischer abdicated his title, Karpov became the world champion for the next 10 years and was either the best or second best player for a good quarter century following that. And in this game, we're going to look at his style at that time, a very interesting game he played in that Olympiad against Emil Ungureanu from Romania. Let us jump right in. Karpov begins with the move e4. That's right. At that time, and even during his world championship titles, when he held the title, he played e4, and not the d4 he would later play in the 1980s against Garry Kasparov. Ungureanu plays c5, the Sicilian defense, and Karpov plays knight to f3, knight c6, and the open Sicilian is on the board. Pawns are exchanged, and now knight to f6 from black. And the reason it's important for black to play an early knight to f6 is to put pressure on e4, and this way white has to play knight to c3 and block this c-pawn. And this prevents white from playing c4 early and creating a Maroczy bind type structure. d6, and we have the classical Sicilian on the board, and bishop to g5, the Rouser, or Richter-Rouser Sicilian from Karpov. And the idea is to put pressure on this knight, even threaten to take it, and do some damage to black's pawns. Black plays e6, so the queen now defends that knight. Now there's a pin, but he'll be able to relieve that pin quickly with his bishop. But he avoids that pawn structure damage. Queen to d2, Karpov simply gets his queen off of the back rank and prepares to castle long. Bishop to e7, putting an end to that pin. Karpov castles and black castles. And so the position is inherently sharp. Anytime you have opposite sides castling, you're dealing with a complex position, and this position is definitely complicated. f4 from Karpov. Either one of these pawns could advance. Either the pawn can go to f5 or the pawn can go to e5, depending on circumstances. But Karpov would like to use these two pawns to launch in the center and attack. Now, black makes an interesting and good decision. He takes the knight on d4. The idea is, of course, he has less space, so he wants to trade off minor pieces. That's the rule. When you have less space, you want to trade pieces. But he also wants to remove the knight from that c6 square so he can maneuver his bishop from c8 to d7 to c6 and put as much pressure on that e-pawn as possible. He wants it to advance, and so he can open that diagonal. Queen retakes, and now queen to a5, putting some pressure on a2 and white's queen side, but also there's some lateral pressure. This bishop on g5, if it were ever to become undefended, this queen could grab it. Bishop to c4 from Karpov. This bishop can come back to b3 for defense, but it could also switch to d3 for attack later. It's very flexible on that square. Bishop to d7, continuing that maneuver to c6 to maximize the pressure on the e4 pawn and square. And here, Karpov goes ahead and plays e5, grabbing space and trying to cut the board in half by using a pawn at e5. That's the strong part, of course, is that he has space, and that, again, the board will be cut in half. The downside is that pawn's going to be a bit vulnerable, so he has to be careful. Pawn takes, and now bishop to c6. Black can put his bishop on this diagonal he's been looking forward to because there's basically a lateral pin. This queen at a5 keeps white from taking the knight. Here, if white were to take that knight, then black could take the bishop with check, and when the king moved, bishop takes f6, and black would just be completely winning here. So Karpov is obviously not going to allow that. Instead, he plays the move bishop to d2. And of course, if you're familiar with these lines, we are still in theory here. But what he's doing is, this is a double attack, basically. He's attacking the knight on f6 with the pawn, but he's also threatening a discovery against the queen. He won't be able to win material, but he can get some positional advantages from this. Ungureanu moves the knight back to d7, keeping some pressure on this pawn at e5. And now, knight to d5. This is the classic idea here. Basically, the bishop attacks the queen, the knight attacks the bishop at e7, and black can defend that bishop. He can play queen to c5 or queen to d8. They both lead to the same thing, because white would take on e7, as Karpov does in the game, with check, and queen takes e7. And here we have sort of a tabia for this line, a sort of a standard position that you sort of have to know the ins and outs of if you play this either side of this line. And basically, it's pretty simple. White has a space advantage, which could lead to a kingside attack. Karpov also has the bishop pair, and those are very nice things to have. And he does have a slight advantage. However, black has his own trumps. This knight is putting pressure on this weak pawn at e5. This bishop from black on this light square diagonal is very strong. And both sides can potentially attack. Black can also attack on the queen side. So we still have a very sharp and unbalanced position. Karpov just centralizes. Rook h to e1. Rook to c8 from black, aiming at white's king on c1. And here Karpov plays an interesting move. He plays queen to f4. A stronger move might have been rook to e3, sort of shifting over, a rook lift, shifting over for the attack. However, the move queen to f4, I think, is sort of a classical Karpov way of playing. Basically, it's just a move. It doesn't make his position worse. It doesn't make it better. But what it does, it gives his opponent a chance to go wrong, to move one of his pieces to a square that isn't ideal, to just make a bit of a mistake. Karpov is drawing, I think, his opponent in like that, trying to give him enough rope to hang himself. a5 from black, continuing to expand on the queen side, which is a good move. King to b1 for king safety on the queen side. And now knight to b6 is played. The better move, it turns out, was b5, gaining a tempo against that bishop, gaining space on the queen side. If Karpov were to play bishop to d3, then black can play knight to c5, hitting that bishop and getting a decent position here. So Karpov would probably play bishop to f1 and just play with his space and bishop pair, keeping a slight advantage. But knight to b6 is a bit of an imprecise move. Basically, he alleviates the pressure that he had on the e5 pawn, and what he does is he pushes Karpov's bishop to a square it really already wanted to go to, bishop to d3, aiming at this h7 pawn and at this king side. Now, the idea, of course, is he's putting his knight on d5, a strong square, but it was actually maybe better placed on d7, believe it or not. Karpov moves his queen. It was under attack. And the threat is at some point to play the bishop to g5 and create some dark squared pressure on the king side. Black moves his queen to c5, away from any direct attack from the bishop, but also lining up potential threats against c2. c2 is defended now, but it might not be later. A strong move from white is queen to h4. Then if g6, c4 kicks the knight, the idea is to move pieces away from these dark squares so his bishop and queen can get in on them. This is a sample line, and if knight to b4, he could go ahead and play bishop to h6, and there's not much black can do to stop queen f6. He could give up his own queen by playing it back to f8, but obviously that would be lost. But the move Karpov plays is also strong. Rook to e4. Now moves like queen to h4 followed by rook to g4 or rook to h4 are really quite scary for black. Here, black goes ahead and plays b5, starting basically continuing his race on the queen side versus Karpov's play on the king side. But at this point, Karpov is leading in that race. It might have been better for black to play g6, sort of blunting this bishop at d3, but white still keeps an advantage even in this position. After b5, Karpov plays queen to h3. Obviously, the bishop and the queen work together to attack h7, and this the rook can go to g4 or h7 and have a very strong attack against black's king. Here, Ungurianu plays knight to b4, trying to get rid of this very powerful bishop. If he can exchange that knight off for that bishop, it would help him immensely. Here, it turns out, modern computers show us that Karpov could have gone ahead and given up the exchange here. Rook takes b4, because after pawn takes rook, queen h7, king to f8. And I think this next move maybe have been one that they missed without the help of our Silicon friends, and that's this shot, bishop to g6, which looks ridiculous, but is actually very strong. The bishop cannot be taken, and the threat, of course, is queen h8, queen g7, and there'd be a pin, and yeah, it'd be trouble. And if he takes the bishop, then queen h8 check, king f7, rook to f1 check, king over, then bishop g5 check, and it's a quick mate. Queen to e7, queen takes queen as mate, and if king to e8, queen to f7. his mate. So Karpov could have taken that knight, but he plays bishop to e3 instead, counterattacking the queen. Again, also a good move. If the queen goes to e7, then rook takes b4. Works very well. If he takes with a pawn, this queen takes away the king's flight square. So he would get mated, actually, in that case. But what black does instead is really his best chance. He goes ahead and takes the rook with his bishop. Now here, if Karpov takes the queen, that would be a mistake, because after bishop takes d3, pawn takes bishop, rook takes c5, black is actually okay here. He has a rook and a knight in exchange for a queen, but his pieces work together very nicely. His rooks are about to double on a file, and the attack has sort of disappeared over here. So this is near equality for black. So Karpov does not do that. He does not take the queen. Instead, he takes the bishop. Now he has threats all over the board. He's threatening to take on h7 with check. He's threatening black's queen, and he's also threatening the rook at a8. And black has a very tough decision to make. He decides to go ahead and take on e5, grabbing that pawn and hoping this queen can defend g7 and help out that way. But it's too little too late. Karpov takes on h7, king to f8, and then he goes ahead and takes the rook at a8. In this position, if queen takes bishop, then queen h8 check, king e7, queen takes c8, and he would be up an entire rook. And if rook takes a8, let's go this, queen h8, king e7, queen takes a8, and he'd still be up a rook because black does not have time to take the bishop because queen d8 is checkmate. So what Ungurianu does instead is he plays, after bishop takes a8, king to e7 to preempt this check on the back rank. But what Karpov does is very Karpovian. He just plays queen back to e4. He grabbed material, and he's up a minor piece. So now he offers the exchange of queens. After queen to c7, he plays queen to b7, pinning the queen to the king. And now black cannot avoid the exchange of queens, and he would go into an endgame down a whole bishop. Karpov would have the bishop pair. And in this position, because of that, black resigned. This was the player. I wish they had been able to play Karpov and Fischer. This was how he was playing in 1972 when Fischer was the world champion. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.